everyone, I'm Claudine, and today I'm going to discuss the nervous system and its influence to emotional behavior. First, I'm going to discuss emotions, autonomic arousal, and the James Lang theory. So, let's first define what is emotion. So, psychologists typically define emotion in terms of three components: the cognitions, the feelings, and actions. Emotional situations arouse the autonomic nervous system, which has two branches, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. The sympathetic nervous system prepares the body for brief, vigorous fight or flight responses, while the parasympathetic nervous system increases digestion and other processes that save energy and prepare for later events. How does the autonomic nervous system relates to emotions?
Psychological researchers shown that there are four emotional situations, which are the subjective label, physiological arousal, behavioral expression, and cognitive interpretation. In subjective label, here are the examples: sad, joy, fear, disgust, anger, and many more. For the physiological arousal, it emanates from autonomic nervous system or the fight or flight response. It's involuntary behavior that happens within our body. While in the behavioral expression, it is more voluntary. It is the things that happens in your body language in your face. And then the last would be the cognitive interpretation. It is what's going on inside of your head during an emotion situation. So, to give you an example, here, we had a little girl who had a surprise by his father by giving her a dog as her birthday gift. Her subjective label would be happy and surprised, while for her physiological arousal, maybe blushing, increase of heartbeat, or twitching stomach because of happiness. Her behavioral expression would be based on her facial expression, her eyes and mouth widen, and maybe she's teary-eyed. And for her cognitive interpretation, maybe, my family loves me so much because they gave me my favorite dog. Another example is here, the little boy saw a monster in his bedroom. So his subjective label would be scared or afraid. And for his physiological arousal, maybe shaking, goosebumps, sweating, and increase of heart rate because of the fear. While for his behavioral expression, his eyes and mouth widens. And for his cognitive interpretation, maybe, this monster's going to kill me.
Common sense holds that first we feel an emotion, which then changes our heart rate and prompts other responses. So in common sense view, it says here that when you encounter a frightening situation, first you might feel fear, and then after that you tend to run away or increase your heart rate. In contrast, according to James Lang theory, the autonomic arousal and skeletal actions come first.
The James Lang theory flipped the common sense theory. In common sense theory, the emotion causes the arousal, while in James Lang theory, a stimulus causes a bodily reaction which produces emotions.
The cognitive aspect comes first. You appraise something as good, bad, frightening, or whatever. According to Kawasaki, ordinarily, you make that appraisal within a split second. Your appraisal of the situation leads to an appropriate action, such as running away, attacking, or sitting motionless with your heart racing. The James Lang theory leads to two predictions. People with weak autonomic or skeletal responses should feel less emotion, and causing or increasing someone's responses should enhance an emotion. Let's consider the evidence. First, is physiological arousal necessary for emotions? People with damage to the spinal cord are paralyzed from the level of the damage downward. People who cannot move their arms and legs certainly cannot attack or run away. Most of them report that they feel emotions about the same as before their injury. This finding indicates that emotions do not require feedback from muscle movements. Second, is physiological arousal sufficient for emotions? According to the James Lang theory, emotional feelings result from the body's action. If your heart started racing and you started breathing rapidly and sweating, would you suddenly feel an emotion? Well, it depends. If you had those responses because you ran a mile, you would attribute your feelings to the exercise, not the emotion. However, if they occurred spontaneously, you might indeed interpret your increased sympathetic nervous system arousal as fear. For further explanation, let's watch this video.
Now let's look at some theories of how emotions work. Let's start with the common sense view. In this view, a stimulus prompts an emotion, which in turn prompts some bodily arousal. So in this case, a frightening spectacle fills our villain with fear, which makes him sweat and makes his heart rate rise. In the mid-1880s, two scholars, William James and Carl Lang, independently came up with similar theories that contradicted this common sense view. James and Lang both suggested that instead of emotions causing bodily arousal causes emotions. So to return to our previous example, that would mean that the sight of the hero on his threshold makes our villain's heart beat faster, his hands tremble, and his palms sweat, and these physiological changes cause him to feel fear. But this theory is vulnerable to a few criticisms. First, it is possible to have physiological arousal without any accompanied emotion. For instance, your palms might sweat because it's hot, but that sweat won't make you feel nervous, just kinda gross. Second, physiological changes can be too slow to precede the conscious experience of emotion. Our villain might feel scared as soon as he sees our hero, but it might take a few seconds for him to start sweating. Third, the same set of physiological responses are associated with very different emotional experiences. A faster heart rate could mean fear, but it could also mean anger, or surprise, or joy. Finally, there is evidence that physiological feedback is not necessary for emotion. For example, patients with spinal cord injuries who have lost most of their physiological feedback still experience the same emotions as before. However, in the James Lang theory's favor, there is notably some slight evidence of dissipation in their emotional reactions.
Next, let's proceed to the contributions of left and right hemispheres.
Another hypothesis relates the two hemispheres of the brain to different categories of emotions. First, the activity of the left hemisphere, especially its frontal and temporal lobes, relates to what Jeffrey Gray called the Behavioral Activation System, or the BAS, marked by law to moderate the autonomic arousal and the tendency to approach, which would characterize either happiness or anger. The second one is the increased activity of the frontal and temporal lobes of the right hemisphere is associated with the Behavioral Inhibition System, or the BIS, which increases attention and arousal, inhibits actions, and stimulates emotions such as fear and disgust.
The difference between the hemispheres relates to personality. On the average, people with greater activity in the frontal cortex or the left hemisphere tend to be happier, more outgoing, and more fun-loving. People with greater right hemisphere activity tend to be socially withdrawn, less satisfied with life, and prone to unpleasant emotions. According to Sander, the right hemisphere appears to be more responsive to emotional stimuli than the left. For example, listening to either laughter or crying activates the right amygdala more than the left. People with damage to the right temporal cortex have trouble identifying other people's emotional expressions or even saying whether two people are expressing the same emotion or different ones. Now let's proceed to the functions of emotions. What good emotions do? For certain emotions, the answer is clear. Fear alerts us to escape from danger. Anger directs us to attack an intruder. Disgust tells us to avoid something that might cause illness. The adaptive value of happiness, sadness, embarrassment, and other emotions is less obvious, although researchers have suggested some plausible possibilities. Also, Also, emotions provide a useful guide when we need to make a quick decision. Sometimes, your gut feeling is useful. The last would be the decision-making after brain damage that impairs emotions. Damage to parts of the prefrontal cortex blocks people's emotions in most regards, except for occasional outburst anger. It also impairs decision-making. People with such damage often make impulsive decisions without pausing to consider the consequences, including how they will feel after a possible mistake.
And now, let's go to the summarization of the discussion. First, the four emotional situations, which are the subjective label, physiological arousal, behavioral expression, and cognitive interpretation, wherein in subjective label, these are the sad, joy, fear, disgust, anger, and many more. While in physiological arousal, it emanates from autonomic nervous system or the fight or flight response, and it is involuntary behavior that happens within our body. Next would be the behavioral expression. It is more voluntary, and it is the things that happens in your body language in your face, or basically your reactions. The last would be the cognitive interpretation. It is what's going on inside of your head during an emotion situation. Next is, according to the James Lang theory, the feeling aspect of an emotion results from feedback from actions of the muscles. Next, consistent with the James Lang theory, people who have impaired autonomic responses have weaker emotional feelings, although they continue to identify the cognitive aspects of emotion. Next, feedback from facial movements or other actions can strengthen an emotional feeling, but they are not necessary for such feelings. Next, activation of the frontal and temporal areas of the left hemisphere is associated with approach and the behavioral activation system. The corresponding areas of the right hemisphere are associated with withdrawal, decreased activity, and the behavioral inhibition system. The right hemisphere is more effective than the left for recognizing emotional expressions. And then lastly, brain damage that impairs emotional feelings and responses also impairs decision making. One interpretation is that people decide badly because they do not quickly imagine their emotional reactions to possible consequences.
Thank you for listening, and I hope you learned something from my discussion. Thank you.